There are places in our memory we reserve for history. They are well-lit rooms, filled with familiar names and dates, neat timelines of events we learned in a classroom. We are taught to see the past as a settled thing, a story with a clear beginning, a middle, and an end, its lessons catalogued and its mysteries solved. But that is not history. That is a story we tell ourselves to keep the darkness at bay. True history is not a well-lit room. It is a sprawling, ancient house, filled with corridors that have been walled off for centuries, with doors that are locked and bolted from the inside. It is a collection of whispers, of stories that were never supposed to be told, the ones that were intentionally buried under the foundations of empires, glossed over in the name of national pride, or just deemed too fundamentally horrifying for the textbooks. What if the most important stories, the ones that tell us the most about who we are the ones you never learned? What if the truth of our world is written not in the official record, but in the margins, in the testimony of the forgotten? Tonight, we are not here to walk through the well-lit rooms. We are here to find the hidden keys, to unlock the bolted doors. We will journey into the darkest corners of our past, to unearth the secrets that have been waiting in the silence. We will hear the story of a seemingly innocent caregiver who turned a mother's last hope into a child's grave, of a political leader who used hunger itself as a weapon to erase a nation, of a group of soldiers who literally coughed up their own lungs while charging into battle, and of a modern, cultured city that was forced to eat itself to survive. These are the bodies they tried to bury, the truths they tried to hide. And tonight, we are bringing them into the light. These are 5 terrifying historical secrets you didn't know. Historical Secrets 5, The Baby Farmer of Winton. There are places on this earth that feel like a promise. New Zealand in the latter half of the 19th century was one such place. For the millions trapped in the crowded, grimy, and rigidly class-bound society of Victorian Britain, it was marketed as a utopia in waiting. Pamphlets and posters in London, Glasgow, and Dublin sang a siren song of a distant paradise, a land of rugged beauty, gold in the rivers, and boundless opportunity. It was a place where a person could escape the suffocating structures of the old world and build a life of dignity and freedom. After a grueling, 100-day journey across the world's most unforgiving oceans, stepping onto its shores was meant to feel like a baptism. It was a land of second chances. But the people who came to this new world did not come empty-handed. They brought with them their tools, their ambitions, and their hopes. And they also brought their ghosts. They carried across the vast ocean the same unyielding social codes, the same harsh moral judgments, and the same unforgiving religion that they were supposedly leaving behind. They built a new society, but they built it with the old world's most rigid and unforgiving blueprints. And in this fragile paradise, they constructed a cage. It was a cage not of iron bars, but of whispers. Of reputation. Of the curtain-twitching neighbor, the disapproving vicar, the town gossip. It was a world built on the fragile concept of respectability, and for a woman, this cage was particularly small and suffocating. Her virtue was not a private matter, it was her entire social and economic currency. In a society where a woman had almost no independent legal or financial standing, her purity was her value. To lose it, or to be perceived as having lost it, was to suffer a kind of social death. It was to be utterly and completely ruined. Now, imagine you are this woman. You are young, you work hard, and you live in a world where your every action is scrutinized. You have made a mistake born of love, or perhaps you were the victim of something far darker. In the eyes of this society, the distinction hardly matters. The result is the same: you are pregnant, and you are unmarried. The terror begins quietly. It's the morning sickness you have to stifle while serving the master's breakfast. It's the subtle loosening of your corset, praying no one will notice. Every day is a performance, a desperate act of concealment, because you know that discovery means the end of everything. The moment you can no longer hide your condition, the doors begin to slam shut. The family that once loved you may now see you as a source of unbearable shame, a stain upon their good name. They may turn you out onto the street to protect their own fragile standing in the community. Your employer, upon discovering your secret, will dismiss you without a second thought. Who would employ a fallen woman? You are now without family, without income, and without a home. There is no government that will help you. There are no social services to call, no charities that will take you in without judgment. The Church, which preaches forgiveness, offers only public condemnation. You are utterly, terrifyingly alone. The shame is a physical presence, a cold weight in your stomach that never leaves. Every whispered conversation you overhear, every sideways glance from a stranger on the street, feels like a fresh accusation. And then, the child is born. In a cold, rented room, perhaps with the help of a single, discreet midwife who demands a price you cannot afford, you bring a new life into the world. But this moment, which should be one of joy, is one of pure, unadulterated terror. Because this tiny, innocent baby in your arms is now the living, breathing proof of your social ruin. You cannot work while caring for an infant, and you cannot care for an infant without work. It is an impossible, heartbreaking paradox. You are trapped. It is a desperation so absolute, so profound, it feels like drowning in plain air. What do you do? What choices do you have? Some women, in the depths of their despair, sought out back alley abortionists, risking infection, disfigurement, and death. Others chose to abandon their babies on the steps of an orphanage or a church, a desperate gamble on the kindness of strangers in a world that had shown them none. And some, in a final, tragic act, chose to end their child's life, and sometimes their own, rather than face the slow, public agony of starvation and shame. But then, as you skim the classifieds in the local newspaper, your eyes fall upon a small, unassuming advertisement. It is a lifeline, a whisper of hope in the suffocating darkness. It reads something like this. A respectable married lady wishes to adopt a young child. A comfortable home and a mother's love are assured. Apply in the strictest confidence to Mrs. M. Dean, The Larches, Winton. A respectable lady. A comfortable home. Strictest confidence. The words are a balm to your raw and terrified soul. The fee she asks for is a one-time payment, a sum that feels impossibly large, but perhaps you can borrow it, or use the last of your meager savings. It is a single, final price for your child's future, and for your own chance to disappear, to start again, to perhaps one day reclaim a life from the ashes of your reputation. It feels like the only answer. It feels like a miracle. So you make the journey. You wrap your baby in the best blanket you have, and you board a train, your face hidden behind a thick veil, your heart a leaden weight in your chest. You arrive in the small, rural town of Winton and make your way to the property called The Larches. And there, at the door of a modest cottage, you meet her. Mrs. Minnie Dean. She does not look like a monster. She is matronly, calm, perhaps a little severe, but her voice is reassuring. She speaks of providing a good, Christian upbringing. She doesn't ask too many questions. She takes your child. She takes your money. And with a final, gut-wrenching look at the tiny face you will never see again, you turn and walk away. You are heartbroken, but you are also relieved. You believe you have just saved your child from a life of poverty and shame. You believe you have given them a chance. You have no way of knowing that you have just paid for their funeral. You have handed them over to a predator veiled in respectability, a woman whose business was not caregiving, but death. Her name was Williamina McCulloch, born in Scotland in 1844. But the woman the people of New Zealand knew was a carefully constructed fiction. When she arrived in the colony, she presented herself as the grieving widow of a respected doctor from Tasmania. It was a brilliant, calculated lie. In the 19th century, doctors were figures of immense authority and trust. By claiming this connection, Minnie was cloaking herself in a borrowed mantle of scientific knowledge and middle-class respectability. It was a fiction designed to soothe the fears of her desperate clientele. No evidence of this, Dr. McCulloch, has ever been found. She eventually married an innkeeper and farmer named Charles Dean, a quiet, simple man who seemed to live in the shadow of his wife's formidable personality. After a series of failed business ventures and financial struggles, they settled on the small plot of land near Winton that they named the Larches. It was from this unassuming cottage, surrounded by a flower garden and a few scattered trees, that Minnie Dean began to build her dark enterprise. She became a baby farmer. Now, the term itself was not immediately sinister. In an era before legal adoption, social services, or widespread contraception, baby farming existed in a legal and moral gray area. It was a private, unregulated, and often desperate solution to the public problem of unwanted children. Some baby farmers were genuinely charitable, providing a real, if humble, home for these infants. But the entire practice was deeply suspect, and it was ripe for exploitation. The method of payment created a dark and perverse incentive. A weekly or monthly fee meant it was in the caregiver's financial interest to keep the child alive and healthy. But a one-time, lump sum payment, the kind Minnie Dean preferred, flipped that logic on its head. With a single payment up front, every day the child remained alive was a day it cost her money for food, for clothing, for care. For a fee of, say, £10, a child who lived for a year might consume £8 in expenses, leaving a meager profit for a great deal of work. But a child who died within a week, that child represented almost pure profit. It was a simple, brutal, and horrifying piece of business arithmetic. And for Minnie Dean, it became her entire business model. She began advertising in newspapers across the South Island, carefully crafting her image. She was not just a caregiver, she was a foster mother, a Christian woman offering a loving home. She understood the language that would appeal to these desperate women, the words that would assuage their guilt and fear. Her home, the Larches, was described in glowing terms, a far cry from the grim reality of what it was, a small, overcrowded, and increasingly filthy cottage. The reality was that Minnie Dean had a profound and chilling disregard for the children in her care. Neighbors would later testify that they rarely saw any children playing outside, a strange and unsettling silence for a home that was supposedly filled with them. The local postmaster noted the constant stream of parcels arriving for Mrs. Dean, but also the disturbingly small amount of food she ever seemed to purchase. She was a pillar of the community on the surface, a regular churchgoer with a placid demeanor. But behind the closed doors of the Larches, a very different story was unfolding. She was not just neglecting children, she was cultivating a persona, a mask of respectability that allowed her to operate in plain sight, turning a societal tragedy into a personal, profitable, and murderous enterprise. For a time, the business model worked. Desperate mothers came, money was exchanged, and children disappeared. In the 19th century, infant mortality was a tragic and accepted fact of life. Diseases like diphtheria, measles, and cholera could sweep through a community, and babies, with their fragile immune systems, were the most common victims. As many as 1 in 10 infants did not survive their first year. This grim statistic provided Minnie Dean with the perfect cover. When a child died in her care, who was to say it wasn't simply God's will? It was a statistical fog, and within it, a predator could hunt with impunity. The first official crack in her respectable facade appeared in 1889. A 6-month-old baby in her care died suddenly. The cause was listed as convulsions. 2 years later, another death, this time a 6-week-old infant. An inquest was held. The coroner, a grim-faced man named George MacLeod, listened patiently as Minnie, dressed in sober black, explained the child's sudden illness. Her home, he noted in his report, was overcrowded and not an ideal environment for raising children, but in an era of widespread poverty, it was hardly unusual. With no concrete evidence of foul play, he had no choice but to rule the death was from natural causes. Minnie Dean was officially cleared. But the whispers in Winton did not stop. They grew louder. People in the small, tight-knit community began to notice things. They noticed the number of babies that went into the Larches, and the very few that ever came out. They noticed Minnie Dean on the train, always traveling, often with a small, bundled infant on her lap. Local police, particularly a constable named Hughes, began to take an interest. He found her constant advertising for more babies to be deeply suspicious. If her home was already full, as she often claimed, why was she so eager for more business? It felt less like charity and more like a relentless, predatory hunger. The police began a quiet, informal surveillance. And then they discovered something that shifted the motive from possible neglect to calculated, predatory greed. They learned that Minnie Dean had been attempting, and repeatedly failing, to take out life insurance policies on the infants in her care. Let that sink in. The financial incentive was no longer just the small, one-time fee from a desperate mother. It was the potential for a much larger payout from a dead child. She had approached multiple insurance agents, but her requests were so unusual, so ghoulish, that she was turned down every time. The insurance companies, it turned out, had more stringent moral standards than the child welfare system. This discovery was the turning point for the police. They now knew they were not dealing with a negligent caregiver. They were dealing with a woman who saw the children in her charge as a potential cash crop, to be harvested through death. Their fears were nearly confirmed in 1892. Police in Christchurch received a tip and intercepted Minnie as she was traveling. She had just adopted a 3-week-old baby girl from her mother for a fee of £25. When the police examined the child, they were horrified. The baby was filthy, emaciated, and its feeding bottle was filled with a foul-smelling mixture of sour, curdled milk. The detective who rescued the infant wrote a chilling line in his official report. "I believe this woman would have killed or abandoned this child before she got to Dunedin, if it had not been taken from her." It was a damning assessment. And yet, with no dead body, there was no hard proof of murder. Minnie was allowed to continue her business, now more secretive than ever, using aliases and fake names to dodge the growing scrutiny. For 3 more years, she operated in the shadows, a predator hiding in plain sight, a ghost on the railway lines of the South Island. The final act of this horrifying story began on a cold day, May 2, 1895. A railway guard named William Phelan was working the line between Winton and Lumsden. He noticed a familiar passenger board his train, Mrs. Minnie Dean. He saw that she was carrying a tiny baby, wrapped in blankets. She was also carrying a tin hat box, the kind a lady might use for travel. Later on the journey, he saw her get off the train. But something was different. She still had the hat box. But the baby was gone. Other witnesses who had helped Minnie with her luggage that day would later testify to the same strange detail. The hat box, they recalled, felt unusually and unnervingly heavy. This was the final piece the police needed. The disappearance of the baby on the train, coupled with the strangely heavy hat box, was enough to secure a search warrant for the Larches. Constable Hughes and his men began the grim task. First, they searched along the railway line, looking for any sign of a discarded body. They found nothing. Then, they turned their attention to Minnie's own property. Specifically, to her flower garden. They began digging, their shovels slicing into the soft, damp earth of the flower beds, a place of life now suspected of concealing death. It didn't take long. Buried in a shallow grave, they found the first body. It was a baby girl, Dorothy Carter, just a year old. She had been reported missing. Then they found another, a 1-month-old infant named Eva Hornsby. An autopsy would later reveal Eva's cause of death was asphyxiation. She had been suffocated. Dorothy's was an overdose of laudanum, an opium-based tincture commonly used in the Victorian era as a sedative to quiet fussy babies. In Minnie Dean's hands, this soothing medicine had become a poison. They kept digging. And then they found a third body. It was the skeleton of a young boy, perhaps 4 years old. He was so decomposed that he could never be identified. He remains a Jane Doe to this day, a silent testament to the true, unknown scale of Minnie Dean's crimes. The trial was a national sensation. The gruesome details that emerged from the investigation captivated and horrified the public. A morbid carnival atmosphere descended on the courthouse. Souvenir hatboxes, grotesquely containing baby dolls, were sold to the crowds outside. Minnie's lawyer, Alfred Hanlon, argued passionately that the deaths were tragic accidents, a result of ignorance, not malice. He painted her as a simple, uneducated woman overwhelmed by her circumstances. But the evidence, presented methodically by the prosecution, was overwhelming. The train journey, the heavy hatbox, the laudanum, the failed insurance policies, and the 3 small bodies buried in her own garden, it all painted a picture of a woman who was not a caregiver, but a cold, calculating serial killer. Throughout the entire trial, through the most damning testimony and the most horrific revelations, witnesses noted Minnie Dean's unnerving composure. She sat silent and impassive, her face a mask of detached calm. There were no tears, no outbursts, no signs of remorse. It was perhaps this chilling lack of emotion that sealed her fate in the minds of the jury. On June 21, 1895, after deliberating for less than an hour, the jury found her guilty of murder. While awaiting her execution, she wrote a rambling, self-serving account of her life, claiming she had cared for a total of 28 children. By her own count, 5 were still alive when her home was raided, 6 had died of natural causes, and 1 had been returned to their parents. That left at least 14 children completely, terrifyingly unaccounted for. We will never know their names, or what horrors they faced in their final moments at the Larches. On August 12, 1895, Minnie Dean was hanged. She remains the only woman in New Zealand's history to be executed. Her case tore the lid off the dark underbelly of Victorian society, exposing the terrible desperation so many women faced. It forced a national reckoning, leading directly to new laws, the Infant Life Protection Act of 1896, to regulate adoption and fostering, in the hopes that such a thing could never happen again. But no law could ever erase the terrifying secret of the Winton baby farmer, the respectable, matronly woman who turned a garden of flowers into a children's graveyard, and a mother's last, desperate hope into a child's final breath. Historical Secrets 4. The Harvest of Sorrow. There are places on this earth so fertile, so blessed by sun and soil, that they seem to be a promise made real. A promise of abundance, of life, of a future rooted deep in the land itself. For centuries, Ukraine was such a place. Known as the breadbasket of Europe, its rich, black earth, the famous Kornizem, was the envy of the world. This was not just land, it was the soul of a nation, a living entity that breathed with the seasons and held the collective memory of a people in its dark, lonely depths. A nation of farmers, of poets, of people whose identity was woven from the golden threads of the wheat they grew and the deep, enduring rhythm of planting and harvest. To them, bread was not merely food, it was sacred, a symbol of life, family, and hospitality, the centerpiece of every major life event from birth to death. The Ukrainian people have always been fiercely independent, their spirit as resilient and untamable as the wild steppe grass. Their history is a long, often tragic, song of struggle against empires that sought to claim their land and crush their culture. The Russian Tsars, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Ottoman Empire, all had tried, and all had ultimately failed to extinguish the flame of Ukrainian identity. This flame was kept alive not in grand armies, but in the quiet defiance of the village. It lived in the language, a melodic tongue Moscow repeatedly tried to suppress, dismissing it as a mere peasant dialect. It lived in the vibrant folk songs, the Dumai, epic ballads that recounted tales of Cossack heroes and a lost golden age of freedom. It lived in the intricate embroidery of the Vyshyvanka, where every stitch told a story. And above all, it lived in their connection to the soil, a bond they held onto with a stubborn, quiet pride. To be Ukrainian was to understand the land, to feel the turn of the year in your bones, and to know that from this earth, life would always spring forth. But in the early 20th century, a new shadow fell across this ancient land. A shadow cast from Moscow, a shadow that wore a human face. Joseph Stalin. He was not a czar, but a new kind of ruler, a man of steel, as his name suggested, who saw history not as something to be inherited, but as something to be forged, violently, in the fires of revolution. He was the architect of a grand, brutal vision, the transformation of the vast, agrarian Russian Empire into a mighty, industrial, communist superpower. This vision was called the Five-Year Plan, an obsession of production quotas and smokestacks, and it demanded a sacrifice. A sacrifice of tradition, of individuality, and ultimately, of millions of human lives. At the heart of Stalin's plan was a policy called collectivization. The idea, on paper, was a utopian fantasy of communist efficiency. The state would seize all private land, all livestock, all farm equipment, and consolidate it into massive, state-run farms, or kolkhozes. The independent farmer, the backbone of Ukrainian society for 1,000 years, was to become an extinct species. They were to be transformed from masters of their own destiny into state laborers, cogs in a vast agricultural machine designed to feed the burgeoning cities and fund the nation's industrialization through grain exports. But this was not merely an economic policy. It was a declaration of war. A war against the Ukrainian spirit itself. Stalin and the men in the Kremlin saw the independent Ukrainian farmer, the Kurkul as they were pejoratively labeled, as a fundamental threat. The term Kurkul was twisted by propaganda to mean a greedy, exploitative capitalist, but in reality it was often used to target the most experienced, knowledgeable, and successful farmers, the very people the villages relied upon. Their self-sufficiency, their deep-rooted traditions, their quiet refusal to bend to Moscow's will, these were seen as seeds of nationalism, a dangerous, bourgeois contagion that stood in the way of the Soviet dream. Stalin himself was deeply paranoid about Ukraine. He had witnessed its brief, heady period of independence after the Russian Revolution and saw the flourishing of its language and arts in the 1920s as a direct challenge to Moscow's authority. He believed its national consciousness posed the single greatest threat to the integrity of the Soviet Union. To break the farmer was to break the nation. To control the breadbasket was to control its people, body and soul. And so, the war began, not with tanks and guns, but with paper decrees and men in leather coats. A war to seize the harvest, and in doing so, to seize a nation's future. A genocide does not happen by accident. It is not a natural disaster, a drought, or a blight. It is a choice. It is a series of deliberate, calculated decisions, a machine built piece by piece with the express purpose of human destruction. The Holodomor, which in Ukrainian means to kill by starvation, was just such a machine. It was an architecture of hunger, designed with a chilling, bureaucratic precision and implemented with ideological fervor. The first piece of this machine was the grain quota. In 1932, the Kremlin imposed a quota on Ukraine that was, by any rational measure, impossible to meet. It was 44% higher than the actual, record-breaking harvest of that year. It was a demand for grain that simply did not exist. This was not a miscalculation. It was a death sentence disguised as an economic plan. When villages inevitably failed to meet these impossible targets, the punishment was swift and merciless. The state declared that the farmers were hiding the grain, that they were saboteurs and enemies of the people, who were actively trying to undermine the Soviet project. It was a monstrous lie, but it was a lie that armed the state with a justification for what came next. Brigades of party activists, often aided by the secret police, the NKVD, descended upon the countryside. These brigades were a motley crew of the ideologically zealous and the desperate, sometimes composed of young communists from the cities who had been taught to despise the peasantry, other times made up of a village's own poorest members, pitted against their neighbors in a cruel game of survival. They were called the Thousanders, and they moved from house to house, from village to village, with a single-minded purpose, to find the grain. They used long metal rods to probe the earth for buried caches, listening for the telltale thud of a hidden container. They tore up floorboards, ripped open mattresses, smashed open the great clay ovens that were the heart of every home, scattering the ashes of last night's meager fire. No hiding place was safe, no plea for mercy was heard. They were not just collecting the state's quota, they were taking everything. A new law was passed, a law the starving peasants called the Law of Spikelets. It decreed that anyone, even a child, caught taking so much as a handful of grain from the fields after the harvest could be shot or imprisoned for 10 years. It criminalized the most basic human instinct for survival. The fields, which had once been a source of life, were now a place of death, patrolled by guards. The brigades took the seed grain needed for the next year's crop. They took the small reserves of flour a family had hidden to bake bread for their children. Vegetables from gardens, pickles from jars, the last sack of potatoes, all of it was declared property of the state. They were empowered to take any and all food, a policy of in-kind fines for failing to meet the grain quota. It was a system designed to leave nothing. Then came the next piece of the machine, the blacklists. Villages that failed to meet their grain quotas were placed on a kornadashka, a blacklist. This was more than just a mark of shame, it was a quarantine of death. A blacklisted village was surrounded by NKVD troops. All trade was forbidden. No food, no fuel, no medicine was allowed in. The village cooperative store was shuttered, its goods carted away. It was an economic siege, turning entire communities into inescapable concentration camps where the only currency was time, and it was rapidly running out. And finally, the machine's outer wall was built. The borders of Ukraine were sealed. As the famine tightened its grip, as people began to leave their homes in a desperate search for a single crust of bread, they found their way barred. The state introduced an internal passport system, specifically denying passports to the peasantry, effectively chaining them to their dying villages. Without a passport, one could not buy a train ticket, could not register for work in a city, could not legally exist anywhere but in the place they were starving. The NKVD established checkpoints on all roads and railways leading out of the Republic. An estimated 220,000 peasants were arrested trying to flee. Most were sent back to their villages to starve. The breadbasket of Europe, a land of such impossible abundance, had been turned into a vast, open-air prison. A prison where the sentence was starvation, and there was no possibility of escape. The trap had been set. The architecture was complete. The silence of the fields was about to be answered by the silence of the dead. Statistics can numb the mind. 4,000,000. 5. The numbers are so vast, they become an abstraction, a sterile figure in a history book. But the Holodomor was not a statistic. It was a universe of individual, private agonies, repeated in house after house, village after village. It was the story of a mother watching the light fade from her child's eyes. It was the story of a man, once strong and proud, now too weak to bury his own family. To understand the heart of this secret, we must listen to the voices of those who lived it. The voices of the silenced. One survivor, Nina Monastirska, remembered the silence that fell upon her village. At first, she said, the dogs disappeared. Then the cats. The familiar sounds of village life, the barking, the crowing of roosters, the lowing of cattle, all vanished, leaving an unnatural, deathly quiet. The hunger began as a gnawing ache, a constant, dull companion. But soon, it became a monster, a madness that consumed all thought, all morality, all humanity. Hope died first. Then shame. Then, for some, even love. Social bonds, forged over centuries, dissolved in the matter of weeks. The village, once a place of community, became a landscape of suspicion. A neighbor was no longer someone to share with, but someone who might steal your last hidden potato. Families turned inward then on each other. People ate anything to survive. They made soup from weeds and nettles, from acacia pods and burdocks. They ground up tree bark and corn cobs into a coarse, indigestible flour that tore at their insides. They boiled leather belts and shoes until they were soft enough to chew. One survivor recalled his mother making cutlets from linden leaves. They were bitter, but they were food. The fields, once a source of life, were now barren, picked clean of every last stalk and root. The silence of the villages was broken only by the soft, shuffling footsteps of the starving, their bodies swelling grotesquely from hunger edema, their skin thin and translucent. They were ghosts, haunting their own homes, their eyes holding a look of vacant, bottomless despair. Apathy became its own plague. Many simply lay down in their homes and waited for the end, having lost the physical and spiritual strength to even search for another weed to eat. And then, the final taboo was broken. In the depths of their despair, some were driven to the unthinkable. Survivor accounts are filled with hushed, horrified whispers of cannibalism. It was a desperate, soul-destroying act of survival. Children were warned not to talk to strangers, not to wander off, for fear they might be taken. This was the ultimate success of Stalin's machine. It had not just starved the body, it had forced people to devour their own souls, to erase the very lines that separated man from beast. Every day, a cart would make its slow, grim journey through the village streets. The driver, often paid in bread, a cruel irony, would call out, "Anyone have any dead?" And the bodies would be brought out. A father would carry the impossibly light body of his child, a bundle of sticks wrapped in rags. A son would drag the skeletal remains of his parents. They were taken to the edge of the village and tipped into a mass grave, unceremoniously, without a prayer, without a name. A generation was being erased from the earth, their stories and their futures shoveled into the cold, black soil they had once so lovingly tilled. While millions starved in a prison of silence, the world outside remained largely unaware, or worse, unwilling to see. The Soviet Union, under Stalin's iron control, orchestrated a massive, cynical campaign of denial. They sealed their borders not just to people, but to the truth. Foreign journalists based in Moscow were forbidden from traveling to Ukraine, their movements carefully managed, their reports subtly censored. The official state narrative was one of triumph, the glorious success of collectivization, a bumper harvest, a happy and prosperous peasantry. It was one of the most audacious and successful lies of the 20th century. But the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried, has a way of seeping through the cracks. A few brave individuals risked everything to bear witness. A young Welsh journalist named Gareth Jones, having heard rumors of the famine, defied a travel ban, slipped away from his Mindas in Moscow, and walked into the Ukrainian countryside. What he saw horrified him. "I walked through villages and 12 collective farms," he wrote. "Everywhere was the cry, 'There is no bread. We are dying.'" He saw the swollen bodies, the empty homes, the fields choked with weeds. He described children with lifeless eyes and stomachs bloated. Jones escaped the Soviet Union and published his story, telling the world of a man-made famine of colossal proportions. Another journalist, Malcolm Muggeridge, reporting for the Manchester Guardian, also managed to see the devastation firsthand, writing of a war on the peasants and a land of starving people. But their voices were drowned out by a chorus of denial, led by one of the most influential journalists of the day, Walter Duranty, the Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times. From his comfortable position in Moscow, plied with special privileges by the Kremlin, a fine apartment, a car, access to the best food and drink, Duranty actively worked to discredit Jones and other eyewitnesses. He publicly called Jones a liar. His articles, which would shamefully win him a Pulitzer Prize, repeated the Soviet propaganda line with a cynical twist. "There is no famine or actual starvation," he wrote, "but there is widespread mortality from diseases due to malnutrition." It was a cowardly, semantic game, a deliberate deception that provided cover for Stalin's regime. Why did he do it? For access, for fame, and perhaps because he, like many Western intellectuals of the time, was seduced by the grand Soviet experiment, willing to believe that the deaths of a few million peasants were a justifiable price for progress. His betrayal of his profession, and of the truth itself, was a crucial part of the conspiracy. He and others like him helped lock the gates on the prison of Ukraine, ensuring that no help would come. The deception went even further. The Kremlin orchestrated Potemkin tours for influential Westerners. French Prime Minister Édouard Herriot was given a carefully stage-managed tour of Ukraine in the summer of 1933. He was shown bountiful collective farms, happy, well-fed children, and bustling shops. The starving were cleared from the streets, the shops were stocked with food for the day, and loyal party members posed as cheerful peasants. Herriot returned to France and declared to the world that there was no famine in Ukraine, calling it a garden in full bloom. It was a lie that gave international legitimacy to Stalin's secret. The world, in the grip of the Great Depression and wary of the rise of Nazism, was politically and economically incentivized to believe the lie. The Soviet Union was a potential ally and a massive market. The lives of millions of Ukrainian peasants were a price the world was willing to pay. For more than 50 years, the Holodomor was a secret buried in a mass grave of history. Within the Soviet Union, it was a forbidden topic. To speak of it was to risk imprisonment, or worse. Survivors carried their trauma in silence. The official record was erased. Generations grew up with no knowledge of the famine that had decimated their nation. It was a secret that didn't just kill people, it tried to erase a nation's memory, to sever the connection between a people and their own past. In the years following the famine, a new policy of Russification began. Ethnic Russians were moved into the empty villages, given the homes and the land of the dead, a final, cynical act to dilute Ukrainian culture and identity. But the memory was kept alive. It lived in the quiet stories passed down within families, in the Ukrainian diaspora who had escaped Soviet rule and who fought tirelessly to tell the world what had happened. When Ukraine finally gained its independence in 1991, the secret could at last be brought into the light. Archives were opened. Mass graves were excavated. The long-suppressed stories of the survivors were finally recorded, their frail, elderly voices trembling as they recounted the horrors they had been forced to bury for a lifetime. Today, the Holodomor is a central part of modern Ukrainian identity. It is a story of unimaginable loss, but also of incredible resilience. It is a reminder of the price of tyranny and the enduring power of the human spirit. It is impossible to understand Ukraine's fierce, unyielding fight for its sovereignty today without understanding the trauma of the Holodomor. The memory of a time when Moscow sought to extinguish their very existence is burned into their national consciousness. The fight to have the Holodomor recognized internationally as an act of genocide continues, a fight not for revenge, but for justice, and for the simple, profound truth of what was done to them. It is an unhealed wound, a scar on the soul of a nation that reminds them, and should remind us all, that the most terrifying secrets are the ones that are deliberately forgotten. And that the only way to truly sleep peacefully is to first remember the dead. Historical Secrets 3: The Execution of Robespierre. Come closer. Let us walk together through the streets of a city that has forgotten how to sleep. This is Paris, in the summer of 1794. The air, thick and humid, hangs heavy in the narrow lanes, carrying the scent of wood smoke, of sour wine from the taverns, of unwashed bodies, and something else, something metallic and sharp, a smell that clings to the very stones of the Conciergerie prison. Paris, the heart of the revolution, is holding its breath. For over a year, this breath has been held in the grip of the terror. It began as a promise, a purifying fire to cleanse the new republic of its enemies, to protect the fragile flame of liberty from the shadows of monarchy and treason. But fires, once lit, are rarely so easily controlled. The promise of purification has become a spectacle of paranoia, a fever that has broken the city's spirit. At the center of this storm stands one man, a figure as cold and unyielding as the blade of the machine that has become his symbol. Maximilien Robespierre. Look at him. He is not a man who invites warmth. There is no hint of earthly appetite in his thin lips, no glint of easy laughter in his pale eyes. They called him the Incorruptible. And in a way, it was true. In a city drowning in graft and opportunism, Robespierre was unmoved by money, uninterested in lavish comforts. He lived in a simple room in the house of a cabinet maker, his only companions a dog he adored and the adoring family of his host. His one, all-consuming passion was an idea, the Republic of Virtue. A perfect society, built on reason, morality, and absolute devotion to the state. It was a beautiful, crystalline dream. And to protect it, he would unleash a nightmare. He was once a provincial lawyer, a quiet, principled man who wrote impassioned pleas against the death penalty. He arrived in Paris as a champion of the people, his voice a clear bell ringing for justice and equality. But the intoxicating pressures of power, the constant threat of foreign invasion and internal rebellion, began to warp the principled lawyer into something else entirely. The dream of virtue became entangled with a terrifying new logic. To achieve perfect virtue, the Republic must first be purged of all vice. And vice, he began to see everywhere, in every shadow, in every whisper. His vision narrowed until the world was divided into only two categories, the virtuous and the treacherous. There was no room for anything in between. Fear became the new order of the day. It was a quiet, creeping fear that lived not in the grand pronouncements, but in the silences. It was in the pause after a neighbor made a careless joke. It was in the glance held a second too long in the marketplace. It was in the sudden, deafening knock on the door in the dead of night. The law of suspects had made thoughts themselves a crime. A person could be condemned for lacking civic spirit, a charge so vague it could mean anything, and therefore everything. Nowhere was this fear more potent than in the chamber of the National Convention, the very engine-room of the Revolution. Here, the men who had overthrown a king now sat huddled in a state of collective terror. They were prisoners of their own creation, avoiding each other's eyes, speaking in platitudes. Each day, they would vote yes to another list of the condemned, their voices hollow, their hands trembling. To vote no, to show even a flicker of dissent, was to mark oneself for the next list. They sent old friends and political rivals to the guillotine with equal, desperate speed, hoping that by feeding the beast, they might keep it from their own door for one more day. The public, once so fervent, was exhausted. The daily procession of the tumbrils, the carts carrying the condemned to their fate, had become a grim, monotonous ritual. The thrill of revolutionary justice had curdled into a weary, nauseating routine. The city was tired of blood. And Robespierre? He saw the fear, the exhaustion, and believed it was proof that his work was not yet done. The conspiracy against the Republic was deeper, more insidious than he had imagined. The enemy was not just the aristocrat or the priest, it was the doubter, the dissenter, the insufficiently zealous. His paranoia, once a political tool, had become his entire reality. He trusted no one. He spent his evenings writing lists, crossing out names and adding new ones, the architect of a city built on suspicion. The incorruptible had become a tyrant, not of greed or of power for its own sake, but of an idea so pure it had to be paid for with an ocean of blood. The 26th of July, or the 8th of Thermidor by the new revolutionary calendar. This is the day the frayed thread of the terror finally begins to snap. For weeks, Robespierre has been absent from the convention, retreating into a self-imposed isolation. The whispers have grown louder in his absence. Factions are forming. Men who know their names are on his unwritten lists, men like the ruthless Joseph Fouché and the fiery Jean-Lambert Tallien, are beginning to find their courage in shared desperation. Now, he has returned. When he walks to the rostrum, a hush falls over the chamber. He is dressed with his usual meticulous care, a light blue coat, nankeen breeches. He arranges his papers, peers out over his spectacles at the sea of anxious faces. And then, he begins to speak. For 2 hours, his reedy, insistent voice fills the hall. It is not a speech of reconciliation. It is a sermon of righteous fury. He speaks of a vast conspiracy, a league of scoundrels, that has infiltrated the government, the army, the convention itself. He speaks of traitors who wear the mask of patriotism, of corruption that gnaws at the very soul of the Republic. He laments that virtue is in the minority on earth. He paints a picture of a nation on the brink of moral collapse, betrayed from within. The delegates listen, their blood running cold. Every man in that room feels the weight of Robespierre's gaze. Every vague accusation feels like a personal indictment. He is weaving a net, and they can feel it closing around them. He speaks of virtue, of terror, of the final, necessary purge that will at last make the Republic pure. And then, he reaches his conclusion. The chamber is silent, waiting for the final blow. Waiting for the names. But the names never come. He ends his speech with threats, with warnings, but without a single specific accusation. He refuses to identify the traitors he claims are in their very midst. It was his most fatal miscalculation. Perhaps he thought the sheer force of his moral authority was enough. Perhaps he believed that by making everyone a suspect, he would paralyze them all with fear, forcing them to rally behind him to prove their loyalty. He was wrong. In that moment of calculated silence, he did not break them. He united them. The fear that had for so long been a private, isolating terror, "Am I on the list?" was suddenly transformed into a collective, unifying certainty. We are all on the list. The instinct for self-preservation, which had made them compliant for so long, now screamed for rebellion. To do nothing was to guarantee death. To act, however risky, offered the only chance of survival. As Robespierre steps down from the rostrum, the spell is broken. The initial applause is hesitant, thin. Then, a delegate named Cambon, a man in charge of the nation's finances, rushes to the rostrum. "Before I am dishonored, I will speak to France," he cries, accusing Robespierre of paralyzing the will of the convention. The dam has broken. Others stand, demanding that he name the accused. The calls grow louder, more insistent, turning into a roar of defiance. For the first time in months, the voice of open opposition is heard in the convention. Robespierre, stunned and pale, tries to respond, but his voice is drowned out by shouts of, "Down with the tyrant!" His speech, intended to be his ultimate triumph, has failed spectacularly. He leaves the chamber not as a savior, but as a cornered man. The sun sets on Paris. But no one will sleep tonight. In candlelit back rooms and shadowed courtyards, the conspirators gather. Men who were mortal enemies just yesterday now clasp hands, their shared terror a stronger bond than any past hatred. They are a motley collection of schemers, radicals, and moderates, but tonight they have a single purpose: to survive the dawn. And to do that, the incorruptible must fall. The longest night of the revolution has begun. While the conspirators plot in the shadows, Robespierre and his loyalists have sought refuge here, in the Hôtel de Ville, the seat of the Paris Commune, his last bastion of power. With him are his devoted younger brother, Augustin, the fiery, handsome young ideologue, Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, and the wheelchair-bound Georges Couthon. They have been declared outlaws by the convention. This is no longer a political debate, it is a fight to the death. To be an outlaw in revolutionary Paris means any citizen can kill you without trial. The tocsin rings, the call to arms for the loyal sections of Paris to rise and defend their champion. And for a few tense hours, it seems they might. Armed men from the sections begin to fill the square, their pikes and muskets glinting in the torchlight. Inside, Robespierre's allies urge him to act, to lead the insurrection, to strike back against the convention before it can consolidate its power. All of Paris holds its breath, waiting for the incorruptible to give the order. But he hesitates. This is the critical, fatal pause that will seal his fate. Why? Was it a crisis of conscience for the man of law? A refusal to lead an illegal mob against the elected body of the Republic? Was it a loss of nerve, the sudden, paralyzing realization that his power was an illusion, built not on love but on fear? Or was it a deeper, more tragic flaw, a messianic belief that the people, pure and virtuous, would rise on their own to save him, without his needing to stoop to the vulgar business of leading a street fight? We will never know. But as the hours tick by, his inaction drains the energy from his supporters. The night grows late. The armed men in the square, given no orders, no leader to rally behind, begin to drift away, melting back into the dark lanes from which they came. Inside the convention, there is no such hesitation. His enemies, led by a man named Barras, are gathering their own forces, the soldiers loyal not to the Commune, but to the national government. They have a warrant, a purpose, and the courage of desperation. Just after 2 a.m., as a summer thunderstorm breaks over the city, they arrive at the Hôtel de Ville. The great square is now almost empty. The soldiers of the convention storm the building. There is little resistance. They burst into the room where Robespierre and his inner circle are cornered. And in that moment of final, violent chaos, history becomes a blur of conflicting accounts. A single gunshot rings out. Maximilien Robespierre falls, his jaw shattered. Who fired the shot? One of the soldiers, a gendarme named Charles-André Meda, would later claim he fired it himself, becoming a hero of the new regime. But others swore they saw Robespierre turn a pistol on himself in a last, desperate act of defiance, only to flinch at the final moment, the bullet tearing through his jaw instead of his brain. The truth was lost in the smoke and the shouting, a final, bloody mystery at the heart of the terror. All that was certain was the result. The man whose words had sent thousands to their deaths was now silenced, drowning in his own blood. There is no swift end for the fallen tyrant. He is carried from the Hôtel de Ville, a broken thing, and taken to the one place in Paris that represents the very heart of his power, the Committee of Public Safety. They lay him not on a bed, but on a large wooden table in the center of the room, the same room from which he had orchestrated the machinery of the terror. For the next several hours, he becomes a grotesque spectacle. His fine blue coat is stained with blood and mud. His jaw is crudely bandaged with a blood-soaked cravat, holding his shattered face together. He is conscious through it all. He cannot speak, cannot protest. He can only lie there, his pale eyes open, watching. And the people come to watch him. His former colleagues, the men who had trembled before him just a day earlier, now file past to stare, to mock, to savor their victory. They poke his side with their boots. They taunt him with the names of his victims. One man, seeing Robespierre's head lying uncomfortably on the hard wood, slides a small pinewood box of pistol ammunition under his neck as a crude pillow. It is an act not of kindness, but of profound, contemptuous irony. He lies in silence, his body occasionally racked with spasms of pain. At one point, he makes a motion for a pen and paper, but it is denied. His only way of communicating with the world, his voice, is gone. He is utterly, completely powerless, a living monument to his own downfall, displayed upon the very altar of his former authority. A surgeon is eventually called, not to ease his suffering, but to patch him up enough so that he can be fit for the guillotine. The crude bandage is removed, the shattered bone and torn flesh exposed. A low groan of agony escapes him. It is one of the few sounds he makes. The final journey begins. Robespierre is loaded onto a tumbril, the same crude cart that had carried his victims. He is joined by Saint-Just, Couthon, and 20 other loyalists. The journey to the Place de la Revolution is slow, a deliberate parade through the heart of the city. The crowds are immense, larger and louder than for any execution that came before. But they are not cheering for him. They are screaming at him. The same people who had once hailed him as the savior of the Republic now shower him with curses and filth. Windows are rented for exorbitant sums to get a better view. People climb onto rooftops, waving handkerchiefs and shouting with glee. A group of women perform a frenzied dance around the cart. One woman climbs onto the side, her face contorted with rage, screaming directly at him. "Go down to hell with the curses of all wives and mothers!" He remains silent through it all, his head slumped, his face a mask of dried blood and agony. He passes the house where he lived, and the cart is stopped. The door of the house has been smeared with animal blood. He closes his eyes. He is the last of his group to be executed. He is forced to watch as his brother, his friends, and his followers die before him. When his turn comes, he walks to the plank with a faltering step. He is laid down, his neck positioned. And then comes the final, deliberate act of cruelty. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, in order to position Robespierre's head correctly, rips the bandage from his jaw. For the first time in nearly 12 hours, a sound erupts from the silenced tyrant. It is not a word, but a scream. A raw, animal roar of pure, unendurable agony that echoes across the square, momentarily silencing the massive crowd. It is the scream of a man whose entire world has been reduced to a single, final moment of exquisite pain. Then, the blade falls. The executioner holds the head aloft. The crowd surges, a wave of triumphant, cathartic release. The terror is over. The incorruptible is dead. The brutal irony of his end is absolute. The man who had perfected revolutionary justice, who had sent so many to a silent, efficient death, was consumed by its most vengeful and cruel form, his final moments filled with the agony he had denied so many others. The revolution, as it always does, had finally, hungrily, devoured its own. Historical secrets too, the attack of the dead men. Let us leave the blood-soaked cobblestones of Paris behind. Our story now moves forward in time, over a century later, to a different kind of hell. This is not a terror of ideology, but of industry. A horror of chemistry and steel. We are on the eastern front of the First World War, in the summer of 1915. This is the theater of the Great War often lost in the Western imagination. We think of trenches, of mud, of the static, bloody stalemate in France and Belgium. But here, in what is now Poland, the war was a different beast. It was a war of vast distances, of sweeping advances and crushing retreats. By mid-1915, the Russian army was in the midst of the Great Retreat, a massive strategic withdrawal after the German breakthrough at Gorlice-Tarnow. All across the front, the Tsar's armies were falling back, ceding hundreds of kilometers of territory. But in one sector, the German advance had ground to a halt, stymied by an obstacle that seemed to defy both manpower and firepower. It was a fortress, nestled within the sprawling Biebrza marshes, a place of sucking mud, swarms of insects, and ghostly morning fogs. Its name was Osowiec. Osowiec was not beautiful. It was a stubborn, ugly fist of concrete and steel, built by the Russian Tsar to guard a single, vital choke point. Through these marshes ran the only railway and road for 100 miles, a critical artery for any army hoping to advance. To control Osowiec was to control the entire region. The fortress was the cork in the bottle, and for the German Eighth Army, it was an infuriating, unyielding obstacle. They had tried to take it before. In September of 1914, they had thrown tens of thousands of infantrymen against its defenses, believing their superior numbers would overwhelm the Russian garrison. They were met with a storm of machine gun fire and artillery that tore their ranks to shreds. The marshes themselves became a weapon, swallowing men and equipment whole. The assault was a bloody failure. They returned in February of 1915, this time with a new strategy, a new faith in the god of industrial warfare, heavy artillery. They brought their monsters. The famous Big Bertha siege cannons, colossal weapons that could hurl 1-ton shells for miles, alongside dozens of other heavy guns. For a week, the German guns pounded Osowiec in one of the most intense bombardments of the war. The sky screamed. The earth shook. The Russian defenders huddled deep in their concrete bunkers as hundreds of shells fell every few minutes, the concussions so violent they caused nosebleeds and madness. The German command was certain that no structure, and no human spirit, could withstand such a cataclysm. They sent a message to the Russian commander demanding surrender. His reply was simple: he would defend the fortress to the last man. He almost had to. The fortress, brilliantly designed with deep, reinforced concrete bunkers, held. Its guns, though outmatched, fired back with defiant precision. After a week of ceaseless thunder, the German guns fell silent, their assault a costly failure that had achieved nothing. Osowiec had bled them, twice, and still it stood. The fortress had become more than a strategic objective. It was an insult to German pride, a symbol of Russian stubbornness that had to be erased. And so, the German command, under the direction of the legendary Field Marshal von Hindenburg, decided to unleash a new kind of weapon. One that would not simply batter the fortress, but flow into its very veins and suffocate the life within it. Chemical warfare was not new in 1915, but it was about to be perfected on a terrifying scale. The weapon chosen for Osoyek was a mixture of chlorine and bromine gas, a simple but diabolical concoction. Chlorine is a common element, a building block of life. But weaponized, it is a monster. Heavier than air, it does not dissipate into the sky. It sinks. It flows like water, pouring into every shell crater, every trench, every dugout. It is a hunter that seeks out the low places where soldiers hide. Its color is a pale, sickly, greenish yellow. And its effect on the human body is a lesson in horror. When chlorine gas meets water, it creates a chemical reaction. And the human body, the eyes, the throat, the lungs, is full of water. When a soldier breathes in chlorine, he is breathing in the ingredients for hydrochloric acid. The gas begins to dissolve his lungs from the inside out. The delicate membranes of the alveoli, the tiny sacs that pass oxygen into the blood, are shredded, burned away. Fluid floods the lungs as the body desperately tries to fight the chemical burns. The victim is, in essence, drowning on dry land, suffocating in a sea of his own internal fluids. It is a slow, agonizing, and terrifying way to die. The morning of August 6 dawned with a perfect, gentle breeze. A wind blowing from the German lines, directly towards the Russian fortress. At 4 a.m., the order was given. It did not begin with an explosion. It began with a hiss. The sound of thousands of valves being turned on 36 massive batteries of gas cylinders. From the German trenches, a wave began to form. A silent, rolling, greenish-yellow fog, 10 to 12 meters high. A toxic tsunami, moving with the slow, inexorable pace of the wind. It crept across no man's land, a living shroud for the world. The sunlight turned a sickly green as the cloud blotted it out. The grass and leaves on the trees it touched turned black and shriveled. Birds, caught in its path, fell dead from the sky. A strange, sweet, metallic smell, like bleach and pineapple, drifted ahead of it. For the Russian soldiers watching from their trenches, it must have looked like the apocalypse itself. A vision of hell, made manifest and crawling directly towards them. The men of the 226th Zemlyansky Regiment had no defense. They had heard rumors of this new gas weapon being used on the Western Front, but they were just that, rumors from 1,000 miles away. They had no gas masks. They had no training. All they had was their courage, and against this creeping phantom, courage was useless. As the green cloud washed over them, panic erupted. Their officers screamed at them to cover their faces, to use whatever they had. The soldiers grabbed pieces of their uniforms, their underclothes, and soaked them in water or, in desperation, urine, pressing the wet rags to their mouths and noses. It was a pathetic, futile gesture. These makeshift masks, which might offer a moment's protection against smoke, were utterly useless against a dense, concentrated wave of chlorine gas. The hell was immediate. It began with a violent, uncontrollable coughing that tore at the throat. Then came the blindness, as the acid burned their corneas. A searing pain, as if their lungs were on fire, filled their chests. They stumbled and fell, gasping for air that wasn't there, their bodies convulsing. They began to cough up a yellow, frothy liquid, then blood, then pieces of their own dissolved lung tissue. Their skin, starved of oxygen and ravaged by the chemicals, began to turn a pale, grayish-green. Within minutes, the forward positions of Osoyek Fortress had been transformed into a mass grave. The 9th, 10th, and 11th companies of the regiment were almost completely wiped out. hundreds, and then thousands, of men died in unimaginable agony. But in the heart of this chemical inferno, amidst the dead and the dying, a few men held on. They were the ones furthest back, the ones who received a slightly less concentrated dose. They were dying, but more slowly. And among them was the commander of the 13th Company, a 21-year-old sub-lieutenant named Vladimir Kotlinski. He was dying. He was spitting up blood, his breath coming in ragged, burning gasps. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest. But as the green fog began to thin, and he heard the sounds of the advancing German infantry, 7,000 of them, moving forward, confident that nothing could have survived the gas, something inside him refused to break. He looked around at the handful of men from his company who were still on their feet, men who were just as wounded, just as poisoned as he was. And through the agony, through the chemical haze, he made a decision. He would not die hiding in a bunker. He would die fighting. He began to rally the last, gasping survivors. The battle for Osoyek was not over yet. For the 7,000 German soldiers of the Landwehr Division advancing on Osoyek, the battle was already over. They were not a vanguard. They were a clean-up crew. They walked with the confident stride of men who had witnessed a miracle of science. The silence from the Russian lines was absolute, a profound, deathly stillness that confirmed the gas had done its work. Their objective was to occupy a graveyard, to walk through the trenches of the dead and plant the German flag. They moved in neat, disciplined lines, their rifles held at a casual port. Some of them likely felt a grim satisfaction. Others, perhaps, a flicker of pity for the men who had died in such an unnatural, agonizing way. But none of them felt fear. What was there to be afraid of? They had just unleashed the apocalypse, and they were the only ones left alive to walk through its ruins. Then they heard it. It started as a single voice, a sound that seemed to be torn from a throat that was no longer whole. Then another joined it, and another. Soon, it was a chorus, a horrifying, unearthly moan that rose from the Russian trenches ahead. It was not a battle cry. A battle cry is a sound of life, of strength and fury. This was the sound of death. It was the collective death rattle of men who should have been silent, a howl of pure, undiluted agony given voice. Through the last wisps of the green fog, they saw movement. At first, it was just shapes, lurching, stumbling figures emerging from the earth. The German officers likely assumed it was a handful of survivors, maddened by the gas, surrendering or staggering to their doom. They ordered their men to ready their rifles, to put the poor creatures out of their misery. But the figures did not stop. They did not raise their hands. They began to run. What charged out of the fog that day was not an army. It was a nightmare. It was Sub-Lieutenant Vladimir Kotlinski, leading what was left of the 13th Company, perhaps 60 men in total. And they were no longer men. They were horrors. Imagine the sight from the German lines. These figures were wrapped in bloody rags, the remnants of their uniforms which they had likely used as feudal gas masks. The skin on their faces and hands, where it was exposed, was burned a ghastly yellow-green, hanging in strips from the bone. They were coughing up their own lungs, spitting chunks of bloody tissue onto their chests as they ran. Their eyes, chemically burned, were white and sightless, or weeping blood. And they were all howling that same, terrible, inhuman cry, a sound that promised a fate worse than a clean death from a bullet. They were the living dead. And they were charging. The disciplined, professional soldiers of the German Landwehr, men who had faced artillery and machine guns without flinching, were confronted with something that did not belong in the rational world of warfare. This was a scene from a medieval vision of hell. Their confidence shattered, replaced by a primal, superstitious terror. The men at the front screamed and fell back. The neat lines dissolved into a panicked mob. They were not being attacked by soldiers. They were being haunted, assaulted by the very corpses they had created. The dead men hit the German lines like a force of nature. They were too far gone to feel pain, their bodies already destroyed. They fought with a terrifying, suicidal fury. They stabbed with bayonets, they clubbed with their rifles, they clawed with their bare hands. The Germans, paralyzed by fear, broke completely. They turned and fled, trampling their own comrades in a desperate stampede to escape the ghoulish apparitions. They ran from the dead, their flight so panicked that many were caught and killed in their own barbed wire traps. The impossible had happened. An army of 7,000 had been routed by 60 dying men. The charge of the 13th Company had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest imagination. They had not only halted the German advance, they had thrown it back in chaos, retaking their own forward positions and even capturing German guns. It was a victory, total and absolute. But it was a victory won by ghosts. The cost was horrific. The men who had performed this miracle were already dead. It had just taken their bodies a few more minutes to realize it. Sub-Lieutenant Vladimir Kotlinski, the young officer who had willed this impossible charge into existence, collapsed. The chemical burns that had ravaged his lungs finally claimed him. He died that evening, having led the most terrifying and perhaps the most courageous counterattack of the entire war. He was 21 years old. The fortress of Osowiec held. The German attack was repulsed. But the story does not end with a triumphant flag waving over the battlements. The attack of the dead men was a tactical miracle, but it could not change the strategic reality. The great retreat of the Russian army continued on all other fronts. Within a few weeks, Osowiec was in danger of being completely surrounded. Its position, so stubbornly defended, had become untenable. The Russian command gave the order to abandon the fortress. The remaining defenders, the survivors of the gas attack and the other garrisons, spent the next few weeks methodically destroying what they had fought so hard to protect. They leveled the walls, blew up the ammunition depots, and wrecked the guns, ensuring that the Germans would inherit nothing but a pile of rubble. Then, under the cover of night, they slipped away into the marshes, leaving the ghost of their victory behind. So why is this incredible story so little known? Why doesn't the name Vladimir Kotlinski rank alongside other great heroes of the war? The answer lies in what came next. The Russia for which these men died would soon cease to exist. The Tsar would be overthrown, the empire would collapse into revolution and civil war. The new Soviet regime had little interest in celebrating the heroes of the old, imperialist war. The story of Osowiec, a testament to the courage of the Tsar's soldiers, did not fit the new narrative. And so, it was buried. It became a footnote in military journals, a local legend, a ghost story whispered by the people who lived near the ruins of the old fortress. It was a victory that history chose to forget. But the story of the attack of the dead men is more than just a forgotten battle. It is a terrifying monument. A monument to the horrors of industrial warfare, to the moment when science gave us the power to create hell on earth. But it is also a monument to the impossible resilience of the human spirit. A testament to the fact that even when the body is destroyed, even when death is a certainty, a small group of men can literally rise from their own graves to stare into the abyss and make the abyss blink first. It is a secret that was silenced by politics and time, a terrifying, awe-inspiring story that reminds us what we are capable of, in both our capacity for cruelty and our capacity for courage. Historical Secrets 1: The Siege of Leningrad. Our final story is not about a single person or a single battle. It is about a city, and the 3 million people trapped within it. Before it was a tomb, it was a jewel. Leningrad? St. Petersburg. A city built by a Tsar on a swamp, a window to the west. designed to be a monument to imperial ambition and artistry. It was a city of impossible beauty, a Venice of the North. A place of poets and revolutionaries, of Pushkin and Dostoevsky. Its theaters hosted the world's greatest ballets, its concert halls echoed with the symphonies of Tchaikovsky and, later, its own native son, Dmitri Shostakovich. The walls of its Hermitage Museum contained one of the greatest collections of art ever assembled, a treasure trove of human genius. It was a city of science, home to the Vavilov Institute of Plant Industry, a seed bank containing one of the world's most diverse collections of plant genetics, a priceless resource for humanity. It was the cradle of the Russian Revolution, the city where the Bolsheviks had stormed the Winter Palace and changed the course of the 20th century. It was a city that was not just a collection of buildings, but a living, breathing symbol of Russian culture, resilience, and history. And for that reason, one man hated it with a singular, fanatical passion. For Adolf Hitler, Leningrad was more than a strategic objective. It was an ideological disease. It was the birthplace of Bolshevism, the Judeo-Bolshevik ideology he had sworn to eradicate. It was the city of Lenin, the man whose name it now bore. Its very existence was an affront to his vision of a new world order. And so, he did not issue orders for its capture. He issued a death sentence. In a secret directive dated September 29, 1941, the German Naval Command recorded the Führer's will. It read in part, "The Führer has decided to wipe the city of Petersburg from the face of the earth. After the defeat of Soviet Russia, there can be no interest in the continued existence of this large urban center. It is proposed to blockade the city tightly and to level it to the ground by artillery and continuous bombing from the air. Requests for surrender are to be rejected, as the problem of the survival of the population and of supplying it with food is one which cannot and should not be solved by us." The plan was not conquest. It was annihilation. A murder of a city, to be carried out by the slowest, most agonizing method imaginable, starvation. The German advance was terrifyingly swift. By late summer, they were on the outskirts of the city. On September 8, 1941, German forces captured the town of Schlisselburg on the shore of Lake Ladoga, severing the last land connection to the city. The noose was pulled tight. In an instant, nearly 3 million people, including 400,000 children, were sealed inside a cage of steel, with the German army on one side and the vast, cold expanse of the lake on the other. The German command knew that the key to breaking the city's will was its stomach. And on that very same day, September 8th, the Luftwaffe launched a massive air raid with a single, devastatingly precise target. The bidet warehouses were not a military target. They were a collection of wooden buildings that held the vast majority of Leningrad's food reserves. The bombing created a firestorm that raged for hours, a pillar of black smoke that could be seen from every corner of the city. The smell of burning sugar filled the air, a sweet, sickening perfume of doom. In a single afternoon, the city's hope for a sustainable food supply turned to ash. The state's response was immediate and brutal: rationing. The bread ration, the absolute staple of the Russian diet, was cut again and again. By November, a manual laborer, the most valued citizen in the Soviet system, received a daily ration of just 250 grams. Office workers, dependents, and children received only 125 grams. This was it. A slice of bread barely the size of a deck of cards. And even this was a deception. To stretch the dwindling supplies of flour, bakers mixed in whatever they could find: sawdust, cottonseed cakes, wallpaper paste scraped from bombed-out buildings, floor sweepings from the mills. The resulting bread was a damp, gritty, almost indigestible substance that provided a few hundred calories, a stay of execution measured in hours. To understand this descent from a vibrant metropolis into a city of starvation, we will turn to the quiet testimony of those who endured it. We will follow the story of a young girl, a teenager named Tanya Savicheva. Before the war, she was a normal child in a large, happy family. As the siege began, she started a small diary. It was not a diary of thoughts or feelings. It was just a record. A litany of death. And then, the winter came. It was one of the coldest winters in living memory, a true Russian winter of legend. Temperatures plunged to 30, 40 degrees below zero. And the city, already starving, began to freeze. The German bombardment had systematically targeted the city's infrastructure. Power stations were destroyed, plunging the city into an almost total darkness, broken only by the flash of anti-aircraft guns and the fires from new explosions. The water mains froze and burst, cutting off all running water. The intricate network of pipes and wires that keeps a modern city alive had been severed. Leningrad was thrown back into the Dark Ages. Life became a series of desperate, primal struggles. The daily quest for water meant a treacherous journey to the frozen canals or the river Neva, where people would huddle around holes in the ice, slowly filling buckets to haul back to their frozen apartments. The daily quest for heat meant breaking up furniture, tearing books from library shelves, stripping the floorboards from their own homes to feed tiny, makeshift stoves called burzwikas. But above all, there was the hunger. It was a physical presence, an ache in the belly that became the only reality. It erased all other thoughts, all other feelings. Love, grief, fear, all were secondary to the all-consuming, animalistic need for food. People boiled leather belts and shoes to create a gelatinous broth. They scraped the glue from behind wallpaper. They ate pets. And then, when all of that was gone, they began to look at the one source of protein that was becoming more and more plentiful with each passing day, the dead. The city was on the precipice of the final, most terrible taboo. On the page of her diary, a Leningrad resident named Vera Inber wrote a simple, chilling observation. A man has died. In the old days, that was a grief. Now it's an event. An event, because a body in the street was no longer just a tragedy. It was a resource. A frozen corpse, wrapped in rags, was a potential source of firewood from its sled, a potential source of clothing, and in the deepest recesses of the city's despair, a potential source of meat. This is the darkest secret of the siege, the one the survivors would only whisper about for decades after. The one the Soviet state tried to erase from history. As the winter deepened and the last of the ersatz food disappeared, the city crossed the final threshold of human endurance. It began to eat itself. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, kept meticulous records. Their files, declassified only at the end of the 20th century, paint a horrifying picture. They made a clinical distinction. There were the Tripoidae, the corpse eaters. These were the desperate, the starving who, driven mad by hunger, would secretly carve flesh from the frozen bodies that littered the streets and cemeteries. One survivor recalled seeing a woman hacking at a frozen horse in the street, and then, when the horse was gone, seeing people hacking at the frozen bodies of their fellow citizens with the same desperate, mechanical motions. It was an act of pure survival, a final, desperate attempt to keep their own heart beating. But then there were the others. The Ludoidae. The person-eaters. As society collapsed, predators emerged. Gangs began to hunt the weakest citizens. They would lure people into apartments with promises of bread, only to murder them for their meat, which they would then eat or sell on the black market as veal, or pork. NKVD reports detail the discovery of dismembered bodies in basements, of cooking pots containing human remains. They arrested a father who had killed his own 12-year-old son to feed his other children. They caught a woman selling jellied meat made from a victim she had murdered with an axe. The police would raid apartments and find human heads in the ovens, buckets of organs on the balconies frozen solid. This was not survival. This was the complete and utter annihilation of the human soul, a descent into a state of nature so brutal it is almost impossible for us to comprehend. The most terrifying secret of Leningrad is not just that people were forced to eat the dead to survive. It is that some chose to become monsters to do so. For every story of incredible sacrifice, like the scientists at the Vavilov seed bank who starved to death while surrounded by tons of edible seeds and grain, protecting them for the future of humanity, there was a corresponding story from the abyss, a tale of the ultimate darkness that resides within the human heart when all light has been extinguished. But even in the deepest darkness, a flicker of light can seem as bright as the sun. For Leningrad, that light came from the east, across the frozen waters of Lake Ladoga. It was a desperate, impossible idea, to create a supply line on ice. They called it the Doroga Zizny, the road of life. It was less a road and more a prayer. A 30-kilometer lifeline across ice that was constantly being shelled by German artillery and strafed by the Luftwaffe. Drivers, often young women, worked in shifts of 20 hours or more, peering through the blinding snow, their truck doors propped open with a piece of wood so they could try to jump out if the ice cracked and their vehicle plunged into the freezing water below. Thousands of trucks, and their drivers, were lost to the icy depths of the lake, their headlamps still visible for a time under the surface, a graveyard of hope. But for every truck that was lost, others got through. On November 20, 1941, the first convoy of horse-drawn sleighs made the journey. 2 days later, the first trucks arrived. They brought in a trickle of real flour, of butter, of ammunition. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The bread ration was raised slightly. And on the return journey, the trucks carried a cargo even more precious than food: people. The sick, the orphaned, the dying were evacuated across the ice, skeletal figures wrapped in rags, their eyes wide with the trauma of what they had seen. The road of life kept the city breathing. It allowed Leningrad to hold on until January 1943, when the Red Army finally broke the encirclement, creating a narrow land corridor. The full siege would not be lifted for another year, on January 27, 1944. After 872 days, the longest and most destructive siege in modern history was over. The city celebrated with a salvo of 324 cannons, their roar echoing over the ruins. But beneath the triumph was a silence that could never be filled. Over 1 million civilians had died, the vast majority from starvation. And what of the young girl with the diary? Tanya Savicheva was one of the lucky ones. She was evacuated from the city across the road of life. But her body, ravaged by starvation, was too weak. She died in a hospital outside the city a few months later, at the age of 14. Her diary, a tiny notebook with 9 horrifying entries, became a symbol of the siege, its final page simply stating, "The Savichevs are dead. Everyone is dead. Only Tanya is left." In the years that followed, the Soviet Union built a new story for Leningrad. It was a story of unshakable communist heroism, of a city of stoic heroes who never flinched, who sacrificed everything for the motherland without a moment of doubt. The monuments they built were grand and defiant. But in this official narrative, there was no room for the darker truths. No room for the desperation, the black market, the mothers who had to choose which child to feed. And certainly, no room for the cannibals. The true, complex, and terrifying reality of what the people of Leningrad endured was buried, a secret hidden not by a single person, but by an entire state. The real history was preserved not in the granite monuments, but in the quiet, desperate whispers of the diaries left behind. In the shaky handwriting of ordinary people who recorded the unrecordable, who bore witness to the abyss, and who left for us the final, terrifying secret, that civilization is a thin veneer, and it takes less than we think for it to be stripped away, leaving only the cold and the hunger. History isn't a clean narrative. It's messy, brutal, and filled with secrets that were never meant to see the light of day. The babysitter who became a murderer, the leader executed with unimaginable cruelty, the famine used as a weapon, the soldiers who charged as dead men, the city that was forced to devour itself. These stories show us that the history we learn is often a sanitized version, polished to be more palatable, to fit a narrative of progress or simple heroism. The truth is usually far more disturbing. It's hidden in the margins, buried in forgotten archives, and whispered in the testimonies of survivors who were told to forget. And these secrets, as horrifying as they are important. They force us to confront the darkest capabilities of humanity, our capacity for calculated cruelty, our terrifying desperation in the face of annihilation, and the shocking fragility of the civilized world we take for granted. They remind us that the past is never truly past. It is always with us, waiting in the silence, in the locked rooms, daring us to find the key. Which of these secrets shocked you the most? Is there a dark chapter of history that you think has been forgotten? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. These conversations are how we keep these stories from being buried all over again. And if you want to uncover more terrifying tales from the past, be sure to watch this video next. Thanks for diving into the dark with me.